I always tell myself is never be surprised when I walk into a big organization
Mhm.
because they're just dominated by bureaucracy and confusion. I've seen some things, yeah, when I document the processes. For instance, I was at one organization, and a lot of teams are stood up based on knee jerk reaction. So this particular case, there was a problem with statements where they were showing wrong numbers to customers. Obviously, a big deal. So they stood up a statements team to govern it, quote unquote. But when I really dug into what they do, they didn't really have a role other than just to be watchers of watchers who watch the watchers. I think that's one of the failures of automation and AI right now, I think, is a lack of understanding of the end-to-end processes. And I define it a little bit differently than conventional process management thinks of it, because they really define it as understanding upstream and downstream processes, which I think is really important. But I think there's two other aspects that are important. One is having a comprehensive understanding of every process, because there'll be gaps and there'll be like bureaucratic processes that slow things down. So really understanding the full landscape. And then the second aspect of it is aligning data. Why do you exist and where are you going in the future? But as part of that, you'll do an environment analysis. So what's the external environment? So competitive landscape, regulatory, economic, et cetera. And then you also do an internal analysis. So where are we strong and weak relative to expectations of where we want to be? Now, if you have a full map of the organization of all the processes, but rolled up at 30,000 foot view level, now it could be complete in that analysis, and they could create a heat map where they're in typical SWOT framework. Where are we strong and weak? Where are there opportunities and threats? Now that enables these strategic decision makers to make priority decisions, and then be more objective in where they align funding to various initiatives. But then you could carry that through to the change management process of once I have that funding aligned, I could create charters that specify which process areas or which processes are impacted by that. But if I've aligned all my data, now I know who the process owner is, has to sign off on stuff. I know what technology it uses. I know what development teams are associated with that technology. I really have the full landscape, and I can be precise in what I'm changing. I was reading this Deloitte State of the AI report where they asked leaders, where do you want to see AI go next? And the plurality of people responded with they want AI deeply embedded in their processes and functions. You can't do that unless you know what your processes are. And there's this concept called digital twin, which is big in manufacturing. In terms of software, I think it's a $183 billion industry, and it's growing 40% annually every year. So it's a big deal, but it's really about creating a virtual model of your real world environment and then educating AI on what your business does so that you could feed it data around any operational signal like what are my defects? What are my issues? What are my customer complaints? What's coming from my process mining data? Now, once you have that, now AI can analyze every bit of your operating environment and look at where's our cost over what the value is for that area. Where do we have customer issues? So that need to be addressed before they become problems. And you could go on down the line. It's been big in manufacturing because it's more physically tangible. It's easy for me to model a factory floor, and there's a lot of smart factories out there that do this. I think from what I've researched, no one's really tackled that in more information based businesses.
Mhm.
So I come from financial services. People could be located really anywhere around the world, and teams can be divided, et cetera. So there's no physically tangible way to do that. So how do you construct a model of the environment? Well, you need a common semantic structure. And the best one to do that is what does my business do by inventorying every single process? So once I have that, I can align all the data, I could create the digital twin, et cetera. Now, I haven't seen this yet, but where I think this is going is with AI agents. And I think this becomes really exciting. Now I could, let's say I'm doing a transformation program, I could not only educate AI on what my business does, but estimating models, et cetera. So now I could say, here's the transformation program that I want to do. And you could have agents in a multi-agent environment, one go into your repository of processes and all the operational intelligence and understand all the impacts. What are the processes that are changing? What's all the resources that back it, et cetera. And then now it could send it to another agent that creates essentially your work plan. So how many
Yeah.
resources are needed, what code needs to be changed, and lay out your plan with detailed estimates for who needs to do what, does dependency analysis, you name it.
Yeah.
You could do automated risk assessments. I think eventually you could create code by having an understanding of what the impacts are, and do automated testing and deployment through CI/CD pipelines. I think a lot of things are possible, but it's not possible if you don't have that context. Well, it's probably chapter 2 where I lay out the framework and the different components. The big thing to understand is you're creating a unified model of how your organization works. And in
Mm.
process management, there's a lot of different model types that people talk about. There's value streams for your end to end, from how you identify or generate an idea to delivering value. There's customer journeys that are also end to end, but from an outside in perspective. There's business capability models, there's process taxonomies, there's process models, there's data, and it really connects all the dots in terms of how all these need to work together to create one view of your organization that different people could look at from their vantage point and get value, but it's all grounded in the same truth of your organization. Exactly. Yeah. You need to look at it as an assistant. And you
Mm.
wouldn't, even if you hired an assistant, a human assistant, you wouldn't necessarily trust everything they say. That trust builds over time. But you ultimately, you're accountable for what you put in an email, the decisions you make, and you still have to retain that ownership. I'll actually say a lot of companies, I think because of the data security, haven't really deployed AI at scale yet. So I think I really don't have an answer to that question, to be honest with you, because I think I've seen a lot of organizations where I worked with one bank recently, and I was creating process inventories, and I was reading their procedure documents because I like to do the homework and create a first draft. And I'm like, this would be so easy if I could feed it to ChatGPT and create a list. And they didn't have it within their environment. So I think they're struggling with data security, and banking is probably more conservative than other industries. So,
Mm.
they're a little bit hesitant to deploy it at scale. I did about 60% of the processes. And when I extrapolate that forward, I estimated there probably would have been about 10,000 processes. Very
Wow.
complex
Wow.
business. So there's a lot to capture, a lot of interviews that have to take place. For a small business, I think it obviously easier because you have less going on. And I think it might be more valuable. So a new startup, for instance, they're going to go through different phases. The first phase is going to be just growth. And you're not necessarily going to think about it efficiency. You're going to be focused on getting to the market, gaining, growing revenue, et cetera. But then you get to a point where efficiency really matters, and capturing all this and understanding how you're using your resources. And, if you're starting to develop bureaucracy or overlaps, to make sure that you address that with a full understanding. I've been skeptical a lot of technology advances like RPA, process mining, have some level of skepticism. I'm not skeptical about AI. I think it's really going to be a revolution. I'm not fatalist though that it's going to take all our jobs and we're going to be slaves to it. I mean, if you've seen the Matrix, we're not going to be end up in pods where they tap into our energy sources, et cetera. I think we're going to have to find an equilibrium.